Good evening, captive audience. Don Anderson here. I hope you all are doing well. I'm not in my usual home office, and Sunny Danforth is not with me this evening either. She is on vacation in Florida, so I'm afraid you all are going to have to do with me and my monologue. So thank you very much for joining. Give me just 1 second here. I'm going to post something on the chat here for you all to take a look at. 1 second, that should show up in just a moment. And basically, what I'm going to invite you to do is click on that link, and that link will lead you to an article that I wrote on Substack, and you can subscribe to all of my rants on that link. But I think one of the things you'll find really interesting in that link is an article around just exactly why it is that we're at war with Ukraine, or rather NATO is at war with Ukraine. And I think it'll really enlighten you and give you some historical background in terms of how we got to this place we are now. Hi, Lori. Thanks a bunch. I'm glad to see that you're there. I'm still pretty new to doing this, so it's nice to get feedback from you all on the chat line that I'm not actually just talking to myself. So thank you all for joining. Appreciate that. The first topic that I thought would be of interest to discuss with you was this whole thing around Greenland and all the noise that Trump is making around Greenland, because I think a lot of people aren't really seeing just what that deal is all about. So I thought I'd shed you some light on that. I'm going to write another post to Substack probably tonight or tomorrow morning, and I would urge you to take a look at that as well. So let me just highlight that kind of high level, how I see it. The first thing you have to realize about great power politics is it's just like real estate business. And the one common adage you have in the real estate business is this: location, 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 right? That's what this whole real estate business is about. Great power politics is all about the acquisition of real estate. And you think about when countries have gone to war, when Germany invaded Poland, that was about what? It was about getting more real estate. When Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, what is that was about? Getting more real estate. When Russia invaded Poland, what was that about? It was about getting more real estate. All the Roman Empire expansion, Ottoman Empire expansion, Austro-Hungarian expansion, every country that became a great power got it because they acquired more real estate. So think for a minute about how Trump got his start in life, and indeed what his claim to fame is. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, and that art of the deal was all about doing what? It was about the acquisition of real estate. So let me walk you back and give you a little bit of a history lesson, I think it will. And most of you are old enough to remember this, but at least you went to public school at a time you actually got a decent education. So some of you will remember this, and you'll see how this all ties together. And the best way to do this is let's first go back to Thomas Jefferson, the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, we were able to acquire that whole Louisiana Purchase, the entire center of the United States, for I think it was 2 cents an acre. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is why in the world would France, ruled by Napoleon at the time, give us such a great deal? They practically gave us the entire center of the country. Well, the reason they did that was they had to do it because Napoleon was at war with France, which they always seemed to be, and they virtually went broke spending all of their money fighting the British. So, in order to save the country from starvation, they essentially had to sell the entire center of the United States so they could continue to fund their war against Great Britain. So, what you have to recognize is that I'm sure Thomas Jefferson knew that. And being ahead of Trump in terms of the art of the deal, he understood that, hey, if we're going to buy the center of the country, now's the time to do it because France is in no position to strike a deal because they have to sell it. And the last thing you want to be in a position, anybody who's done anything with real estate knows this, you don't want the buyer to know that you have to sell it because they'll hold out for the greatest deal. And that's precisely what Thomas Jefferson did. And that's how we wind up getting the Louisiana Purchase for basically a song. Now let's go to the next great acquisition that came to the United States, and that was the purchase of Alaska, which essentially, roughly 100 years later, was basically the same thing. Russia owned Alaska at the time. And Russia, again, like all the European great powers, was doing what? At war. So they were in a war with the Ottoman Empire, and they were at war with the British. And I think they were fighting. And the war was called the Crimean War. Now this should sound familiar to you because guess where Crimea is located? In Ukraine. Does this sound familiar? So history is a funny thing. It's just like Mark Twain said. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And we're going to come back to the whole Crimea Ukraine thing in a moment. So basically, Russia was in a position once again, they were going broke, facing starvation. They had to sell Alaska to raise money. uh, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State at the time, went out and cut this deal with Russia, and they call it Seward's icebox because everybody here lambasted Seward for making such what looked like a foolish purchase at the time. He bought Alaska for I think it was 2 cents an acre. What a deal! Now, he sort of suspected there'd be gold, and 10 years later, the gold was discovered. We had the Yukon Klondike gold rush, over $1 billion resulted in that. But that was only the tip of the, no pun intended, iceberg. Because what happened after that was Standard Oil, Nelson Rockefeller figured out a way to get oil out of the ground, figured out 100 years later that was Prudhoe Bay, billions of dollars worth of oil in Prudhoe Bay in the late 60s. And then in the mid 80s, we discovered Anwar and multiple times more $1 billion of oil located in Alaska. So you ask yourself, how in the world was Secretary of State Seward able to know that 150 years later, Alaska would be such a valuable commodity? Well, he had no way of knowing, but he got such a great deal that was pretty much we had to do it. He thought he was just getting gold, but instead we got gold, we got oil, we got strategic asset geographically located right next to Russia and China, who become our biggest enemies. So now we have a spy outpost, a great military outpost. And he did this way before there was air travel. So you got to ask yourself, how could he know? Well, he didn't know. All of that came from one guy understanding the art of the deal, which brings us to present day Greenland. Now, I've got to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. Then you begin to let the wheels turn and see just how valuable Greenland is. It's just like the Alaska situation. There's 56,000 people on Greenland. Denmark is the country that has it. We could easily take that country by force. Of course, we're not going to do that. What's probably going to happen is we're going to strike some crazy deal where everybody in Greenland gets offered $5 million a piece. And trust me, I think they would take that in the New York Minute. So there's just some food for thought on the whole Greenland thing. I think the whole thing is absolutely fascinating. I hope you find that as fascinating as I did. That all makes sense. Anybody out there, send me a shout out on chat and let me know if that all makes sense to you. So that was the first thing that I thought I would cover. But do click on that link that I just placed in the chat, and you can read more about that in the next Substack publication. So that takes me to the first thing I thought it'd be fun to talk about, and that is the death of the Portland bubbler. So hang on one second. I'm going to pull up a link so that you can look at the Portland bubbler. 1 second here. And the first thing I'd ask you is, how many of you have even heard of the Portland bubbler? Well, the Portland bubbler are those beautiful fountains in downtown Portland. The little things with the four prongs that you can get a drink of water out of. They're absolutely gorgeous, and have been one of the things that made downtown Portland such a cool thing was to have these Benson bubblers, and they're named after Benson himself. Benson High School is named after him also. He was a great construction real estate developer back in like the early 1900s, I think. Well, what this article is referring to is just how much the Democrat Party has destroyed Portland. There was a man who was downtown with his wife, and he went to go get a drink of water on one of these Portland bubblers. He bends over, takes his wife says, "Don't drink that because Portland's so full of fentanyl, so full of drug fiends, so full of nasty people washing their hands and every other body part in the water that she didn't think it was too risky. He thought it was too risky to drink the water." So this man took a drink and promptly keeled over and died. Is that not the saddest and craziest thing you've ever heard? And the article I just sent to you gives you some idea of the background around what's happened to downtown Portland. It's completely unsafe. I mean, people are bathing in those bubblers. I'm trying to find a nice way to say this. This is a family network. Let's just say they're putting certain parts on their body that they shouldn't put because they don't have any toilet paper on the bubblers. So that's how over the top bad downtown Portland has become. This article, one part sad, one part absolutely hilarious. You won't believe it. Well, anything's hard to read about Portland, but that's how dysfunctional the downtown Portland scene has become. And I thought that would lead to, like, it was interesting, kind of a segue And let me can't see if I can't find another link to show you all on the Oregon scene. And this has to do with the Death with Dignity Act. Um, so let's pull that up. So here's something I heard this on the radio today. There was an article, and I wish I'd published this when I heard on the radio. 25% of the businesses, they did a survey, are have had plans to leave Portland over the course of the next 5 years or so. That was this article. Of those businesses, like 68% are planning to not expand in Portland, or they're planning to do any future expansion they do outside of Oregon. So what worse signal can you have for future development than that? And that's combined with what we talked about last week, where the commercial value of real estate in downtown Portland has gone from 3.2 billion as of the year 2020 to now it's down to 1.5 billion. So it's basically cut in half. And if you're ever in downtown Portland, you just walk the streets, you can tell because the buildings are empty. They're boarded up or they're empty. Now they've gotten the tents off the streets. They've gotten the people doing drugs off the streets. So they've managed to clean that up. And the reality is what they've done is they've shifted off of Southeast Portland. So it's someplace where tourists won't see it. But that's not going to solve the problem of people being afraid to go downtown Portland. I mean, it's one thing to have all the drug fiends and criminals off the streets, but it's another thing to walk around in the big major metropolitan city and feel like you're there all by yourself. It doesn't feel safe when you're the only person down there. And I'm not a small guy, and I was down there not too long ago, and my head was on a swivel. And I've been to some pretty rough cities, and I'm telling you, downtown Portland, it may not be rough in the same sense that East St. Louis is rough, but it's equally scary because you're all alone. And if two or three people jump out of the woodwork, um, you better be packing. Let's put it that way. So, how about you find that a interesting read as well? So I thought this would be a great segue to talk a little bit about what's going on the national scene. And I'm going to find a quick article that I could put in the link for you to look at there as well. See, I'm figuring out this technology there. I'm so glad that you all are sticking with me as I learn how this whole podcasting business works on my own without Sunny, because usually Sunny does all this stuff for me. And this last article talks about what Trump is doing to essentially turn the country into a manufacturing superpower, just like we used to be. So right now, you're going to hear what Spiro, some of you might be old enough to remember Vice President Spiro Agnew. He was the vice president under Nixon, as my father used to call him, Tricky Dicky, right? And Spiro Agnew used to talk about the press and call them the nattering nabobs of negativity. Do any of you all remember that? So that's exactly what the press is. So right now, Trump is doing everything he can to fix the problem created by the past administration in terms of running businesses out of the country. So right now, the press is all abuzz about tariffs and the negative impact in the short term of doing tariffs, of the adverse impact on the stock market, and all these other things. What they're not focusing on is the tremendous amount of businesses that are virtually flocking back to the United States. And this article that I just published for you in the chat gives you a sensational opportunity to see just how great a job that is. So print this out for any of your friends who seem to be having fear and trepidation about what's coming down the pike. I won't read all this to you because it's multiple pages long in terms of the number of businesses that are coming back. Here's just a short list. So Apple has announced a $500 billion investment, 20,000 new jobs in the United States. There's another major CEO has announced a $500 billion private investment in artificial intelligence infrastructure in the United States. Taiwan Semiconductor just announced another $100 billion investment in the semi manufacturing chip business in the United States. Eli Lilly, $27 billion investment in its US based manufacturing, probably in Indiana. That's where they're headquartered, again, in the United States. And the list goes on. Clarius Low Voltage Energy Storage, $6 billion plan to expand. GE Aerospace, $1 billion across 16 states. Merck, $8 billion in the United States over the next couple of years. This is just insane. Siemens, $285 million in the U.S. electrical plant. I'm just trying to think of the ones that you would have heard of, right? Because there's just a ton of them. Saudi Arabia investing 600 billion in the United States over the next 4 years, and the list goes on and on. Samsung, electronics giant, localizing their plants that were in Mexico, moving them back to the United States. Hyundai moving their production back to the United States. Nissan moving production from Mexico back to the United States. Mexico moving its next generation Civic hybrid model back to Indiana. It list just goes on and on. We're in for an economic explosion, to my mind, sometime in the next 6 months to a year. So all we got to do is hang on. In the words of Spiro Agnew, ignore the nattering nabobs of negativity, hang in there, and great things are on the way. So, so Marjorie asked a question here, which I think is kind of interesting, and that's with regard to Oregon, a blue state. Will we benefit from these investments? You know, I don't think so in the short term because Oregon's political class is just going to have to wake up. Or actually, I shouldn't say it's political class. Its citizens are going to have to wake up and throw these clowns out. Because right now, one of the biggest impediments to states locating in Oregon is just the insane regulations that companies face. I mean, the regulation. We talk about taxes all the time, but the regulatory environment may be even a greater impediment than the tax situation. I'll give you a classic example. So I had a friend who had a business in downtown Portland, and it was a manufacturing business. And there was some in the city, not him, mind you, the city planted some trees on the sidewalk in front of one of his warehouse doors. There was a car that crashed into the tree, knocked the tree down. The city replaced the tree and then charged him to fix the tree. Yourself. Now, that's not like a huge amount of money, but the fact that it is, you multiply that times how many things like that they do, and they completely dissuade companies from walking in there. In fact, one of the last things he did, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, he relocated all of his manufacturing across the river into Vancouver just because of the situation with regard to the taxation and manufacturing. So there went probably 75, 80 jobs out of downtown Portland and into Clark County on the Washington State side of the river. That's what Oregon does all day long. So most of the benefit that we're talking about here, these companies moving in, they're going to be moving to states like, basically southwestern United States. So Texas, Arizona, Florida. They're going to go to the red states. They're not going to go to blue states because why would you do that? So if the blue states are punished enough, and we talked about this in past podcasts, what happens with these blue states, we just described earlier at the top of this podcast, I talked about how businesses were leaving Oregon. Citizens, productive citizens, by the way, not everybody, your productive citizens leave with them. So in order for them to attract the right kinds of people, the laws are going to have to change here to attract business. And unfortunately, California, Washington, and Oregon are probably going to be the last to the table because they're three of the 5 or 6 most left-wing states in the country. You got to throw Massachusetts and Hawaii in the mix. But here's the positive news. You get punched in the face enough and you'll figure it out. And I think Oregon, to tell you the truth, if we would just fix, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the election laws, I think Oregon's a lot closer to being red than we think. If you took out Lane County, Multnomah County, maybe what's it, Lynn Benton County around Salem, you took those 3 counties out of it, and it's a red state. It really is. I think Trump only lost in Oregon popular vote wise by something like 6 points. That was a lot bigger loss in Washington State. Oregon is not that far off. And I think just a few fixes in election laws might be enough to push it over the top. So there's my long version with regard to that. I hope that you all found that thought helpful. Then moving, I thought it'd be useful to talk about, let's see, what do we got here? USAID. So I'm sure you could not help. I want to say USAID because once upon a time I thought it was aid. Obviously, it's not aid. And let me see if I can't find this article for you all to take a look at here because that has been shuttered also. Don't you love hearing about government offices closing? It just makes my heart warm to be able to say those words. So these people could feel that the same pain they brought to the rest of the country. So here's a quick article on that. And basically, what do we have here? So that office was shuttered. And here's just a quick line out of that. Republican congressman from Brian Mast from Florida basically had a couple of comments around what USAID has done. So some of the things they've done recently, $2.5 million they spent of your tax money for electric vehicles in Vietnam. I'm not sure how American taxpayers benefit from that. How about $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia? Again, I'm not sure how we benefit from that. And how about $32,000 for production of a Peruvian transgender comic book? Hey, there probably are worse ways to spend our money, but I can't think of them. If you can, write on the chat line. I want to hear about it. And here is yet another one. And I think this is pretty fascinating too, because this is one of those completely underreported things. It won't surprise you, but it will amaze you. And that is that there's been found to be a positive correlation between NGO climate funding of climate studies and the likelihood that the study will wind up concluding that man is the cause of climate change. Let me just repeat that. So there's a positive correlation between whether the climate study was funded by the NGO and whether the study was going to show that climate change was man-made. So basically, that's just a short way of saying to you that everything you've heard about climate change and being caused by man-made is pretty much bogus. So one of the things that hopefully changes here in the near term is we'll start getting real studies, or at least you'll be able to see those real studies. Because right now, given the people who've been in charge, they won't publish the real studies. We're only getting to hear basically what they want us to hear. So it's really cool to see that these types of things, with a new administration in place, we're finally starting to get truth. So there you'll see another study around that. I'm giving you all a lot of reading material, but start with my Substack, right? I'm gonna do a little salesmanship here. Oh, by the way, the readings are free, by the way. So I'm not selling anything, but I am selling you on the articles. I think you'll find them really fascinating. Which takes me to the next thing. And if we don't fix this, then really all is not. And that is the whole voter integrity issue. And one of the things I'm so happy that Trump administration is working to fix is these elections, because they will do everything they can to destroy election integrity. But without election with integrity, everything we're doing doesn't really matter, because they'll just find another way to cheat us, which is what they've been doing for years. It just became really obvious in 2020. So this new, what do you call it? Executive order that I almost said Clinton, that was giving away my age, that Trump signed. Just a couple of items about that. So we have laws already in place to enforce voter integrity, but past administrations just haven't enforced them. So here's a couple of things in this new executive order that Trump has signed that are really going to make this next elections, particularly the ones that are coming up in 2 years, because we really need to win those, right? And this is really going to help. So one establishes a single national election day, and so that would prohibit late counted ballots. They get counted that day, or they don't get counted at all. And we all see what a travesty the far left has made of that. Another one's going to bar foreign nationals from registering to vote or donating money. Can you believe that's even legal in the first place? Foreign nationals can vote and donate money for a campaign? That doesn't make any sense. Some of the others require states to keep accurate, up-to-date lists of legal voters. Like, how basic is that? But of course, we all know the famous joke of the dead vote in Chicago, that sort of thing, right? Well, this is designed to keep that sort of thing from happening. Many blue states don't require proof of citizenship to vote. We live in one of those states. Others count ballots late. Foreign nationals skirt campaign finance laws using domestic shell companies and cutouts. So this executive order is designed to take all of that stuff out of the game. So that all will really help. And Nicholas, I'm not sure if we're on X or not. That's a question and that's a great question. I'll have to ask Sonny that, because Sonny and they're responsible for the technology, and Kevin, and it's mostly Kevin, they're responsible for the technology into this. I barely know how to turn on a computer. So there you go. I hope that helps. What's the next article of import here? Secretary Kennedy. So RFK is really just now beginning to to feel his way, feel his oats, if you will. So pretty proud of what he's got going on here too. And I'm going to see if I can't find this. Uh, so you may have heard the word that Trump administration just axed 20,000 jobs from the federal healthcare system. It couldn't happen to a better group of individuals than those folks at CDC. So this is great news also. And here's some of the reasons why I say that. And when you look at that article, you'll see this. None of the vaccines that we give in the first 6 months of life have ever been tested for autism. Can you believe that? So all they've done is mock and pillory everyone who suspects that autism may be being caused by vaccines. Now, it may be true that it has nothing to do with autism. That might be true. But if you don't study it, how would you know it? Number one. And number two, why are you so up in arms and want to call people names because they mentioned that autism may be correlated with vaccines? The fact that they're making so much noise about it tells me, what's that old Shakespearean adage? She doth protest too much. And I think that might be the case here. They're making so much noise that it almost makes me wonder. But the bottom line is, why would you inject anything into a human being, not to mention a child, without it having gone through the proper studies? And somehow we allow vaccines to get around that. That is like insane. They don't do pre-licensing safety testing for vaccines. It's the only product in all of medicine that's exempt from that. It's just nuts. Here's another. So, in fact, this is from the article I just sent to you. CDC's own study of its own system says it captures fewer than 1% of vaccine injuries. In other words, the tracking system, after you take, and they have a system for that, it's called VAERS. I can't remember what VAERS stands for. But when you take a drug, any drug, it's tracked. And then they track the amount of injuries, and things that happen as a result of taking that particular drug. So that way we can see, even after studies, it's called post-marketing surveillance. That is, after it's on the market, it's actually being used in the public. How does it do there? Because it's one thing to perform well in artificial studies, which is the only way that you can study these drugs, see how big they're going to be. But how are they performed when doctors are actually prescribing it for the regular public? And that's the information even more valuable than what happens in the laboratory. So what we're saying here is with vaccines, the system for tracking that doesn't even work. We don't even have one. And it's been 40 years almost, and nobody's making an effort to fix it. That's one of the coolest things about RFK is he's actually going to make an effort to fix it. So we can really see what works and what doesn't work. And the thing about it is, this is true not just for vaccines, it's true for a lot of other stuff as well. And when you consider the fact that in the United States, the average, I might have this off by slightly, but you'll get my point. The average American is on something like 6 different drugs. The average American over the age of like 65 or 70 is like on 10 different drugs. And when you think about this, drugs are studied in terms of how that drug does by itself. There's no way to study a drug in terms of how it does with 6 other drugs in the body at the same time. So if you're taking one drug number A, if you will, and then you're taking B, C, D, E, and F, you have no idea, and neither does the doctor know, what's actually happening. But we do this to ourselves all the time. And it's so great to see we finally have somebody in charge who's going to work for us instead of the pharmaceutical industry. So there you have it. That's a really cool thing, and we'll see what comes out of it. So cool thing there. And then moving right along, you may have heard this. This election that just happened in Wisconsin is actually one of the more fascinating things going on now because of the strategic implications associated with the election itself. So let me see if I can't give you something on that. I don't know if I got don't know if I have a link for that, but let me just speak to it for a minute. Basically, what you have here is Susan Crawford. It was a judicial, so it's for a judge. So Susan Crawford, the leftist, defeated Brad Schimmel in Wisconsin. And I think she won by 6 points, won quote unquote by 6 points. And so the leftist press is making a really big deal out of this because it shows cracks in the Trump, in the Trump voting bloc, if you will. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. And here's that little bit more. So give this some thought. Ms. Crawford got 1.5 million from Illinois governor to run for this election, another million from George Soros, $250,000 from LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman, and millions from a whole bunch of other PACs. There was more than $100 million spent on the election of a judgeship. Now think about this for a minute. That's unheard of. Nobody spends that kind of money on the election of judges. These things you just fly under the radar. So the first thing you got to ask yourself is, why is so much money being spent on a judicial race? And the reason is, and I think there's a lot of legs to this. I didn't think this up. I read this somewhere else. So this is not me being brilliant. I got to give credit where credit is due. I didn't think of this, but I think there's some rationale to it. And that is this: is the far left who are actually stress testing the system to see just what they can get away with. If they spend enough money in the right places, can they get the right people elected? That's the first thing. And the second thing it tells you is they're not that interested as they were before in winning politicians, because politicians can be changed if the election system is reasonably fair. What they're looking to do is to hotwire the judicial system so that they can block the actions of the legislative branch. And take a look at what's happening with Trump with the executive orders. What do we have going on right now? We have a bunch of left-wing judges blocking the ability of the president to do the job that the people want done. I think that's the strategy. And that appears to be what's going on here. Because why else would you dump $100 million in a little judgeship race in Wisconsin? Kind of nutty, but that looks like what's going on. Um, so pretty interesting stuff. Lori, I don't know if they're going to audit that thing or not. I really don't. I don't know how strong the Republican Party is in Wisconsin. You know, a lot of it depends on the strength of the party in an individual state. So if a party is weak in a state, then those kinds of things tend not to happen. I think my instinct is, Oregon's Republican Party is relatively weak because it's been infiltrated by a whole bunch of leftists pretending to be Republicans. That's not true in multiple other states. Wisconsin is a state that used to hang heavily to the left, but I think it got punished so much by the crazy things the progressives were doing that we wound up winning it. So it's still one of those states that's going to be on the fence. Um, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. So on the other front here, more news on Alabama. And I thought this is pretty interesting. Alabama is a state that's pretty much never hear anything about anymore. But there's still some pretty cool things happening in Alabama. The governor of Alabama is Sarah Huckabee, which I tend to forget. And she's got some notoriety, of course. Well, let's see if we can get that to come up. So there was a new bill that she signed into law, basically making over-the-counter basically making ivermectin an over-the-counter product suitable for human beings. Think about what a huge move that is. Remember when that was considered the horse medicine? Human beings couldn't take it. Remember how the left-wing press pilloried that as a solution to the problems that people were having with COVID, when the reality is ivermectin's been around forever. It costs next to nothing, and it worked. And the biggest reasons the leftist media, who were being paid by the pharmaceutical industry, were against ivermectin is because they weren't lining their pockets with it, and there wasn't any profit margin on it. It's the same reason why they're against generic medications in general. So here's something that's been around forever, costs next to nothing, but they're going to block you from using it because it eats into their profits. So I just thought it was awesome to see the states are starting to take a look at that and putting ivermectin out of the hands of the doctors and putting it into the hands of patients so they can get it without going through a bunch of hoops and get it at a low cost. So that was a pretty cool win, if you will. And we're getting lots of wins. As Sonny likes to say, let's just keep on winning. Let's keep rocking and rolling, and we're just keep on winning. We're getting wins. And thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, I've seen her on TV a few times. Huckabee, this is Huckabee's daughter, the governor, and she is outstanding. I think was it United Nations for Trump first go round? She might have been the ambassador to the UN, if I recall. And if I recall, she was really good at that too. Here's another one from a state we rarely hear about. You almost never hear anything good happening out of Mississippi. And Mississippi, I do have a place in my heart for Mississippi. My mom was born in Mississippi, and we used to go there as a kid. But Mississippi is always known as like the poorest state in the United States. Well, here is for once some good news out of Mississippi. So Mississippi may not be the poorest state for long because Mississippi just eliminated the state income tax. Now, If you want to fuel your state's growth, one fast way to do it is to get rid of the income tax or to eliminate the tax or to reduce it to the degree that you can. But you give people more money in their pockets and you give the government less money in its pockets, and you're going to see an explosion. And it completely makes sense. The thing that gets me about this is economics is really not that radical and it's really not that hard to understand, but the press wants to make it difficult. And probably the easiest way to explain it, I think, is let's talk about the minimum wage, for example. The minimum wage is probably one of the worst pieces of legislation ever designed by man. It's supposed to help the poor, but the reality is it hurts the poor. It helps the handful of poor who wind up on TV waving a flag saying, I got a raise. But the 100 poor people who didn't get a job because the company can't afford them, they never show up on TV because that's precisely what happens when you increase the minimum wage. And what it does is it encourages people to find a way to not hire human beings. And this is evident all around us. When you go to the grocery store, what do you see? You see fewer and fewer people working at checkout stand, and you see more and more machines to help you do self-help, right? Because if you self-help yourself, they're not having to pay anybody to do that for you because the cost of hiring a human being costs so much is the company's better off getting a machine to do it. And you see this everywhere. You walk into a fast food restaurant like a McDonald's or something. What do you see? You see kiosks now. Why do you see kiosks? Because human beings cost too much. And a teenager whose true value in the marketplace, he's probably developing, they're probably able to make a profit on a teenager making $12 an hour, but the minimum wage is $20 an hour. Company can't lose $8 an hour. So it's going to stop hiring them. And that's precisely what we see going on. So now we have a black teenage unemployment rate, for example, that's in excess of 50%. Where when I was a kid, everybody had a job. To get a job at a fast food restaurant, you basically walked in, fogged the mirror, and you got a job. And that's the first rung on the labor marketplace. I mean, that's how you learn to work is in these kinds of jobs. They're a great place to start. But now, because of these crazy minimum wage laws, there's no way for young people to get started in a job. And that's precisely the danger of these crazy government induced things. There shouldn't be any law about minimum wage at all. That's something that private citizens decide between themselves. If you don't want to work for that amount of money, then don't take the job. It's as simple as that. But anyway, that gives you just more of a sense on that. They complicate things that are just not complicated. What we need is less government and more citizens making their own decisions around how to run their lives. Because nobody knows more about your life than you in your local arena. People in DC don't know anything about your life. People in Salem don't know anything about your life. The people in your county, that's probably the best you're going to get. But at the end of the day, it's between you and the other citizens next to you to decide how to run your life. And leftists just can't stand that because they think they should run your life. And what we need to do is run them out of Dodge City. So there, sports fans, concludes my rant for the evening. I think I just went through like about 10 pages. Anybody have any thoughts or questions before I call it good that they can put on the chat? I'm not used to bouncing this around I feel helpless without Sunny. All good? Well, I hope you all have enjoyed listening to this rant as much as I've enjoyed giving it. Do look on the link for Substack. If you can register on the Substack, I think that'll be great. I'm just going to start writing once a week. Then there's probably a couple hundred things that have already been written on there. I think you all really enjoy it. And eventually, we'll probably do some podcasts strictly around some of those rants too, because I think you all will find that interesting, particularly the historical piece to it. So thank you all for joining me tonight. I've had a blast, and I'll see you next week. Take care, everybody. Good night.